Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. Ivy is preparing to say goodbye to her friends in the cavalry, the new ever-mounted cavalry of centaurs belonging to Grand Normandy. And she is working her way through the crowds to where they stand ready for takeoff. By now they had wormed their way back and through the ranks. No one challenged them, a perk, perhaps, of being the next court wizard. And here was Brother Eugene, leading Moripus, his old mount, now serving as pack-horse. He greeted her warmly and introduced her to the teenage boy on the horse on his left, Chio, who was shorter than she had imagined and thinner. He shook hands cordially. On Brother Eugene's right was Lieutenant Fletcher on a black horse. "You look very much at home up there," Ivy remarked. "Old farm boy," Fletcher answered, smiling. "Been riding since I can't remember when. Almost went into cavalry instead of vanguard, all part of the reason I volunteered for the Oswick assignment." "I didn't know you volunteered." "Horses and big-time magic and sneaking around all together, wouldn't miss it." And here you are, Ivy thought, with even bigger servings of all three. She wanted to hug both Fletcher and Brother Eugene, but it just wasn't workable here and now, so in turn she held their right hands in both of hers and wished them well. She wanted to add wishes for safe return, but just as when her father had left, she didn't want to talk about safety, since that seemed a way of talking about danger. She squeezed their hands hard and left. Miss Blackholt joined her soon. She had spoken only briefly with the monk and the lieutenant, and had spent most of her time with a young man on a bay at Fletcher's right. "Who was that you were talking to?" Ivy asked. "My cousin Rogier, or Roger if you like. Another Blackholt, but Uncle Edward's nephew, not a son. I wished him well and asked him to look after Uncle Edward. I'm very fond of Rogier, but he's treating this mission like some grand lark, a thrill, the way young men will. Young women, too, I suppose, when they get the chance." Miss Blackholt looked worried and angry. She was not having a good day, but then Ivy reflected nobody was, except maybe people like Roger. "I don't suppose," said Ivy sadly, "that there's any magic for making sure they come back safe?" "Oh, Ivy, you might as well wish for a spell for giving common sense." Brother Eugene waved down to the part of the street where he thought Ivy was. He only had a few seconds before his arm and the rest of him disappeared, wrapped in invisibility. Below, woods and farmland swept away and accelerated as they sank further. He looked away to the horizon, the least terrifying view. "She's a nice kid," Chio remarked conversationally, a disembodied voice on his left. Eugene nodded, then realized this was futile. "She's very sharp and brave. She's the one I told you about, who helped me bring down that Ubersoldat." "Brava." "Indeed. What happened to the sound?" The sound of rushing wind in the background had suddenly stopped. They floated in uncanny silence, invisible. It was almost like being disembodied. Bodies, Brother Eugene reflected. Transformed or chopped and stitched. It's all about bodies here. "Have we stopped?" Chio asked. "Quite the reverse," came Fletcher's voice. "We're flying faster than sound. That rushing noise, that's from where the zone of quiet air that around us rubs against the outside air as we rush by. Now we're leaving the noise behind." "Quiet air?" said Chio. "This wind?" "Leakage," Fletcher answered. Eugene risked a look down and could see the land sliding by. Good. The less time they spent in transit, the less chance of being caught. Soon he saw water below, the channel. It was behind in a few minutes. Silence, invisibility, unearthly height, the combined strangeness made his fear of height fall away. He just stared. The silence was not perfect. There was a little wind rush from the leakage. Eugene heard low voices. One, he thought, chanted softly, praying perhaps. This was good praying weather, so Eugene prayed. There was a lot to pray about. The wind roar came back. They began to descend. Shortly, the height was low enough to speak to Brother Eugene's nerves, something a mortal could imagine falling through. He realized he was floating hunched up, with his legs tucked up under his horse barrel. Why? So he could roll farther and make a longer smear if the magic failed. He deliberately straightened out. Woods and farmland below, late morning sky, a bank of cloud. They were making for it. They dove in, and the world was solid gray, which made things a little easier on Brother Eugene's nerves. But then the thunder struck. Voices cried out all around. "But how?" someone cried out. "These clouds are no storm." "That wasn't natural thunder," Fletcher called back. He was right. Eugene had felt the flare of magic even through the swaddling of the spell that kept them up. "Oh, damn!" Chio wailed. "What?" asked Eugene. "Listen, they'll blow it again." They did. The battle call of the Earl King rang through the mist. "So much for haste giving safety," Fletcher's voice growled. "Let's hope they've saved enough magic for the fight." "Our lords and ladies have deep pockets," Brother Eugene declared stoutly, "and they're holding nothing back." They were still moving, though they could not feel it. The clouds thinned before them, and they soared out above a canyon of white. Just before they did so, they became visible. Why not? The Earl King's riders could see through glamour if they knew it was there, like any fae. Why bother to keep the magic going and just confuse your clients, Brother Eugene reflected. And why not declare yourself? That was certainly the Blood Lady's style. If I die here, thought Eugene, or by going splat down there, at least I've got some memories to take with me. A cavalry of men and monsters trod the clouds, only in duty colors, but with banners flying. Fays mingled among them, some on horses, but others on deer or goats, all clad brilliantly. At the head and flanks rode the lords and ladies themselves, shining white and red. And here, out of the opposite bank of clouds, rode the Earl King's troops. The horses were all gray, and some were clearly made of mist, though others looked solid enough. The riders were wan and naked, wreathed about with a little mist, and translucent. At their head, treading air, was a horse of glass, it seemed, bearing a woman of translucent gray. Eugene thought he could see her bones. "The middle daughter," said a voice beside him. He turned and saw a young man in an emerald green tunic, on a paint horse, milk-white and blood-red, its eyes as green as its rider's coat. "How do you know?" Brother Eugene asked. "The horn call. The daughters and the father each put their own little variations in it." Eugene returned his gaze to the Earl King's daughter. He saw her wave a hand, and somewhere in her troop someone played the horn again. This time they put magic in the notes. Wordlessly they conveyed a meaning. "Fear us." From somewhere in their own ranks, another horn answered. No eerie rise and descant, but a staccato call suitable for a fox hunt. It too was loaded with extra meaning. "Coming through, make way." The reply just repeated, "Fear us." Eugene barely began to wonder what would come next when the Blood Lady answered with a Valkyrie shriek, and every fae in the company charged. Things shot by Eugene's ears, buzzing. His horsehide twitched. Then both hosts, the bright and the shadowy, seemed to churn and fizz. After a few seconds, some men among the mortals laughed. "What's happening?" Eugene asked. Chio stood up in his stirrups and squinted. "They're changing shape, both sides." Fletcher laughed. Eugene turned and saw the agent was watching through a small pair of binoculars. "Our enemies are turning into geese and quails, a lot of them anyway. An unpleasant surprise from the way they're thrashing and flapping, and our fays are turning into hounds and foxes." Now Eugene laughed. It's like a wizard's duel. One changes from rabbit to swallow to trout, and the attacker changes from fox to hawk to pike, only en masse, and she chooses both sides." "How'd she do that?" Chio asked. "The bugs," answered Fletcher. "She was ready for this and had however many shapecaster fays, all she could lay hands on, I expect, ready to turn into little bullets and go cast shapes, the magical equivalent of throwing snares over your foes." Eugene chuckled and watched the fray for a few seconds. Then a thought struck him. "Wait, we don't have to sit this out. The Blackholts wore themselves to ravelings to get a bottle of elixir to every man, jack, and jackass of us. Chio, outwalk to Fitzsimmons and ask him to have everyone get their elixir out to offer to any of our fays that need it." "Wait, Chio," said Fletcher. "Also remind him that we all have guns and we're in range." Chio nodded, but reached out for Brother Eugene. Understanding him, the monk reached back and took a firm grip on the boy's forearm. Now he could walk out of his body and not worry about slipping off his horse into the clouds. Chio slumped as a wolf-shaped breath of mist left him. Less than a minute later, Fitzsimmons' voice came booming over the troops, amplified by Dr. Blackholt's clamor. "Prepare to offer elixir to any fays asking for it. Fire at any hostile targets." Hostile targets were not easy to distinguish at this distance, but Brother Eugene waited for Chio to rouse, got his little bottle of elixir handy, then unslung his rifle. He shot into masses of the enemy rather than picking out individuals. After the fourth shot, he heard Fletcher say, "Why don't they just sink into the clouds?" "Ah," he answered, "that would mean retreating, prideful idiots. Well, look at that." The Earl King's daughter had urged her glass horse up a few yards, as if there were an invisible hill there. It looked as if she were going to lead a charge down onto an advancing mass of channel fays. But to lead, she had to be seen. She stood up in her stirrups, lifted her spear, and left herself wholly exposed. A volley thundered from the mortals. No knowing which bullets found the mark, but at least one did, probably dozens. Horse and rider both fell out of the air, into the cloud, and were gone. A roar went up from the channel fays. The mortals, still stranded on the far side of the misty battlefield, cheered. In counterpoint, a wailing went up from their foes, who broke and now did retreat into the clouds. The channel fays dove after. "Routed! Routed!" crowed Fletcher over the general tumult of cheering and laughter. "She won't come back from that in a hurry." Brother Eugene nodded and wondered if his bullet was one that had hit. Somewhere in the crowd behind him, someone was taking bets on how many decades or centuries it would be before the Earl Princess revived. How he proposed to collect was an interesting question. In a few minutes, the channel fays emerged from the cloud, back in their proper forms. The green-clad elf on the red and white horse spotted Eugene with his friends and rode back through the air to them, grinning all the while. "Good work," Fletcher greeted him. "As was yours," the elf replied. "Very useful marksmanship." "Why don't you guys use guns?" Chio asked. "Is it the steel?" The elf waved the idea away. "I've spent centuries practicing with spear, bow, and sword. I'm going to use the weapons I know best." Fitzsimmons' voice called out, "Prepare for launch." "Launch?" asked Brother Eugene. The elf began edging his red and white fairy horse toward the side of the column. "Off on the flit again, I suppose. We'd better get you to the Schwarzwald quickly. That shrike you lot just put down has a father and 2 sisters, and they'll know about this soon if they don't already. Best deliver you before we get tracked. We'll figure out how to pick you up again another time." Fletcher stumbled invisibly through the black forest. Far off, in 3 or 4 ragged groups, his brothers in arms battled the Ahnenerbe's artificial berserkers. There were gunshots, yells, and roars. He took the last for infuriated Übersoldaten. The forest wasn't truly black, but the foliage was thick, it was late in the afternoon, and there was heavy cloud cover, so it was dark enough. Then were the Tarnkappen really necessary? Fletcher wondered. The enchanted hats made one completely invisible, and Miss Blackgold had been right. Being unable to see your own hands and feet was as bad as working in total darkness. When he actually bumped into Roger Blackgold, he growled softly, "I'm told it's possible to cast a spell so you remain visible to yourself." "Yes," Roger murmured back, "but it makes the spell more complicated, so it's more fragile. Yes, I heard that too." "But the whole beauty of a Tarnkappa," Roger continued earnestly, "is that it's simple and robust invisibility. It doesn't just dust off like naked glamour, and you can recharge it yourself if you can push Vis. You can push Vis, can't you?" "Yes. Are these Tarnkappen your own making?" Fletcher asked, having noticed a defensive note in Roger's disembodied voice. "Well, yes." "They do the job splendidly, but they aren't the tool for this moment. I don't fancy rummaging for invisible grenades with invisible hands." He looked around one more time to be certain, then removed the hat, a floppy, wide-brimmed affair of total blackness. To his surprise, Roger removed his as well. He unslung the pack on his back, opened it, and pulled out a couple of smoke grenades. Roger watched him closely, and, it seemed to Fletcher, eagerly. "Want in on the fun?" he asked the young mage. "How's your throwing arm?" "Pretty good," Roger answered, smiling and taking the 2 grenades from Fletcher, who helped himself to a couple more from his pack. They approached the hunting lodge, former hunting lodge, now laboratory. Fletcher surveyed the facing wall, looking for a promising window. There were 3 windows on the ground floor, but all had been boarded up. He hoisted the pack onto his back and picked up the Tarnkappa. "Let's case the joint," he proposed, and popped the hat back on. A rustling in the leaves behind him told Fletcher that Roger was following. Rounding the corner, they found a great dark metal box the size of a small car. It gave off a deep hum. "Generator," Fletcher murmured. "They must have felt safe here, or they'd have had it inside. Useful information." There were only 2 windows on the ground floor on this side, both boarded up. It looked to Fletcher as though he should have waited on taking out the grenades. "What's that?" asked Roger. "What's what?" Fletcher asked, reflecting that invisibility also made it hard to converse. He couldn't see where Roger was looking or pointing. "I hear horses." Now so did Fletcher. On the next side of the building was a small pen containing 3 horses. They were whickering and shifting about unhappily, scared by the distant gunfire, and probably more scared by the occasional yells. "How curious," said Fletcher. After a few seconds, he asked, "Can you think of any good reason we should let the Ahnenerbe keep these horses?" No, I can't." "Right, then." After pocketing the grenades, Fletcher fumbled around the gate of the pen with invisible hands and opened it. The horses studied the new situation for a few seconds, then filed out at a trot, which accelerated into a run as they vanished into the forest. Fletcher watched them go and wondered about them. The wall by the pen featured 3 windows, all boarded up. "One wall to go," said Fletcher. "If there's no door there, we shall have to start looking for a buried entrance." But there was a porch with a door flanked by 2 windows on each side and guarded. The guard appeared to be a normal German soldier, but there was no telling at this point. He looked worried, clearly listening to the distant sounds of battle. He did not hear their feet shuffling in the leaves, but they were trying to be quiet. He did not smell them, but there were many other people about to smell in the house. Fletcher groped around for Roger. He had been trying to track the boy, so he had some idea of where to grope. Roger didn't jump or yelp when touched, and let himself be led by the elbow back around the corner. Back past the now empty horse pen, then around the previous corner to the side with the generator, Fletcher spoke sotto voce where he had determined Roger's ear to be. "Can you cast a glamour to cancel sound?" "Yes, but then we won't be able to—" "It doesn't have to last long. We won't be out of touch long, and it doesn't matter if it rubs off soon." He pointed to the upper floor where there were 2 windows not boarded up. "Those are our best shots. Pull the pins, chuck them through the glass, then run like hell away, around the lodge up to the door. If you silence us, it won't matter if we rustle the leaves or step on branches or trip and cuss." "I see. Got it." Fletcher rummaged in the leaves at his feet, watched them stir under his unseen hand. He withdrew a handful of pebbles, which promptly faded as they joined him in the glamour. He snorted, cleared a little space in the leaves, and put the pebbles in it. "Could you practice your muffling on those? I want to get my eye in by chucking them at the upstairs windows, and it would be good if they were silent." "I see. May I have 2 or 3? Help yourself." Nothing apparently happened for some seconds. Then Roger's voice said, "Done." 3 pebbles stirred and vanished into his glamored hand. Fletcher picked up the others. Gazing at the upstairs window, he asked, "I don't suppose you have any actual luck with you?" The heir answered with a sardonic snort, "No, sorry. Nor do I have 3 wishes at my disposal, or a fairy godmother on call. Do I dress like a magus magnate?" "All glory and no gold? Right. In your own time, sir." Fletcher pitched 3 pebbles in quick succession at one window, watching carefully since he would hear no click against the glass. He thought all 3 hit. "King David with your sling, help us now." He unpinned and threw a smoke grenade, quickly followed by the second. The first broke the window, and the second followed inside. He saw the neighboring window shatter silently. So David had glamored his own grenades. Good idea. David's second grenade bounced off the wall by the window and landed in the leaves. "Damn!" the young mage exclaimed. "Never mind. Do the sound now. Confusion to our—" The glamour washed over his voice, and he took off. Away, around, and to the front. He tripped twice over branches. He arrived in time to see a satisfying trail of smoke coming out of the front door, as well as the upstairs windows. There was much yelling. The guard dashed into the house with plenty of speed, but not enough to show he was an Ubersoldat. The next 2 men to dash out definitely were. So was the brick-like fellow who came pounding out, carrying an elderly man in a lab coat piggyback. 2 more Ubersoldaten, the door guard, 2 more ordinary soldiers, and a flurry of lab coats fled. Fletcher smiled to himself. No one wants a fire in the house, especially not lab workers, and most especially not alchemists. And these alchemists specialized in potions that let their pets drink petrol and the like. When it seemed no one else was emerging, Fletcher strode up to the porch. By the time he got there, his feet made a normal rustling. The glamour had worn off. He looked around carefully, then tipped his hat as quickly as he could. After signaling his presence to Roger, he stepped in. It was frigid. The cool spring afternoon outside was warmer. He removed the Tarnkappa and unslung his pack. From this he extracted a gas mask. He heard footsteps on the porch, seeing no one. "In here," he called, then coughed in the smoke. Roger appeared in the doorway, coughed, and accepted a gas mask. "Right," said Fletcher. "Let's get going before someone comes back to investigate. If you meet anyone else in here, shoot." He then pulled a camera out of the pack, a custom-made one, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, loaded with a very long roll of film for low light. Roger unpacked another, just like it. They looked around. The former hunting lodge was still divided into rooms, but shelves of equipment and supplies covered all wall space. Ordinary furniture was replaced with lab benches and operating tables. One of the tables was occupied. The occupant was a large fraction of a man, head, neck, and torso down to the sternum. No arms. The rib cage appeared to be empty. The subject was certainly unconscious. If he was alive, it was because of the tubes that ran into his mouth and neck and into the rib cage. All led back under the operating table, where machinery kept up a light, steady chugging. There was no sign of blood anywhere, and the subject's skin color suggested there was none inside him either. The two agents, keeping stony faces, photographed the operating table from several angles and included pictures of the machinery underneath. A little notebook was tethered to the table by a string. Roger held it up, showing Fletcher. On the front was handwritten, OP number 227. Very meticulous, said Fletcher. Take it. Roger nodded, ripped it off the string, and stowed it. He looked at the subject. If we meet anyone else, shoot, he quoted. Fletcher gazed. The man was an enemy, caught in the middle of being made into a much worse enemy, who would try hard to kill Fletcher's brothers in arms. But here and now, he was utterly helpless. But an enemy. Fletcher squatted down and yanked on a cable. The pump fell silent. He stood and looked. The subject looked no different. Roger, on the other side of the table, crouched and found a large bottle connected to the pump. He removed it and with a pipette took a sample of the fluid, which he stored in a little brown bottle. A bit magical, he remarked as he wrote on the label. Here we go, said Fletcher. About 2 feet from the operating table was a rolling table with 2 steel tubs on it, big ones, one long, one squarish. Both tubs were full of a cloudy, yellowish fluid. The long tub contained a pair of arms and a pair of legs. The squarish one held a mass of organs. Roger came over, looked, blenched, took fluid samples while Fletcher took pictures. Also a bit magical, he remarked. Different tang, typical of alchemy. Lots of low-intensity magic, very specific in aspect. Lots of different kinds, mostly in potions. Fletcher nodded and looked around. The shelves that covered the walls had ranks of steel tubs on them, here and there, between massed ranks of bottles and jars. They were labeled. Fletcher strode about, quickly reading and photographing. Eingeweide, Kelle 134. Viscera, source 134. Kopf- und Wirbelsäule, head and spine. Kapitan Eibert Zafka. Nebennieren, Kelle 88. Adrenal glands, source 88. Schweinermagen, lot 32. Swine stomach, lot 32. Herz, Kelle 89. Heart, source 89. And then small tubs with shorter one-word labels. Augen, Sehen, Bänder, Arterien, Venen, Haut. Eyes, tendons, ligaments, arteries, veins, skin. Fletcher took pictures of the contents of the first several, enough to establish that the labels were bluntly factual, and the tubs all full of the same cloudy yellow stuff. Easy to see, he said to Roger, why they keep this place as cold as a meat locker. Simpler to just work in a walk-in refrigerator. Roger had been photographing and sampling the work tables. He finished the last table and opened the door to the next room. He gasped. Fletcher hurried to his side, gun drawn, but there was no physical danger. The room was much like the first one, only smaller. The floor was crowded by 2 operating tables that had been shoved together to form a right angle. The double table was still much too small for the occupant, so that the legs hung over the edge. It was a centaur. And we'll find out what a centaur is doing at the Ahnenerbe lab next time.